ultimately, states are going to be coercive. They have to be coercive. Every state in the world, even Denmark, ultimately, is coercive. But the higher, better form of Christian political engagement is discursive. It is through word and persuasion rather than coercion.
Welcome back to another episode of Faith at the Frontiers, confronting challenges to the Christian faith with hope. What is the difference between thick and thin definitions of nationalism? What are the dangers of deplatforming and delegitimizing people whose views you think are dangerous? And is there a difference between racism and anti-immigrant rhetoric? And should we honour that difference when letting people talk in public discourse? All of these are the kinds of questions we discuss with Nick Spencer in this episode. Nick is a research fellow, a senior fellow at Theos Think Tank based in London, and he offers some very wise insights which help us to see why it's really important not to move the Overton window so that people are not allowed to express their views in public, because that always backfires whenever we do that, according to Nick. Thank you for tuning in, and hope you enjoy the episode. Well, it's a very great pleasure to have Nick Spencer with us on the show to talk about Christian nationalism. Hello, Nick.
Hello there.
And when we start, we always like to get people to give definitions because in a lot of previous episodes, the whole conversation has gone a very predictable way because of how people define Christian nationalism or how people define nationalism in the first place. So could you start just by telling me what you mean by nationalism?
Yeah, I think we need to take one step back and look at the way in which these large, broad, socially mediated terms are used. They are used in a variety of different ways, which means that pinning down singular, definitive meanings that everybody will agree on is effectively impossible. There's a whole kind of hinterland here around the theory of language, which explores how usage is central to meaning. And when it comes to nationalism, park the Christian bit for now, but when it comes to nationalism, it seems to me there are, very broadly speaking, two different ways it is used. One, it's used in a kind of a thin way, a thin, narrow, precise, slightly emaciated way, pertaining to something like a commitment to one's nation. However, we can't in the 21st century talk about nationalism without thinking about the way nationalisms, nationalist movements behaved in the 20th century, which were anything but thin. They were very kind of rich and exuberant and violent and exclusionary. And a lot of people use nationalism in that thick, historically contextual way. And that's often where some of the disagreement comes here. Some people say nationalism can be quite a good thing, really, because it means a commitment to your people, to your country. They're thinking about it in a thin way. And other people will say, no, nationalism is abhorrent because it is violent and exclusionary and aggressive. They're thinking about it in a thick way. So much of the tension then comes in the different ways people are using the term.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And many of the people who seem to be in favour of Christian nationalism are defining it in that slightly thinner sense, just saying, well, it's a good thing to love your nation. It's a good thing to have to prioritize the people you're around rather than people the other side of the world. Whereas the people who are very much against Christian nationalism are defining it in that thicker sense and saying, well, it means worshipping your nation, or it means thinking your nation is better than every other nation, or something like that, which we can immediately see some problems with. So, well, where do we go from here then? If nationalism can be defined either way, then I suppose Christian nationalism can also be defined either way.
Yeah, and one of the challenges, I think, of this, the fact that you have these two kinds of definitions, right, is in conversation, it's not just what general meaning of the word are you using, but what are you pointing to in reality, right? And I think where people are talking past each other is often, people defending so-called nationalist or Christian nationalist movements are downplaying what those movements are actually doing by saying, well, it's just about being connected with your nation. And people are critiquing those movements, are saying, well, but look at what they're actually doing. There are echoes here of this more pernicious form of nationalism, right? So there's a certain, on the one hand, there's a kind of theoretical question, what do we make of nationalism? But there also is a kind of sleight of hand that often happens, right? Where you can sort of use the liquid nature of terms to avoid actually talking about the same things that are happening in the world.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you effectively use nationalism to mean a good thing in one half of the discourse or a bad thing in the other half of the discourse. They become very morally loaded terms. And by definition, therefore, the whole discourse becomes tautological. My good thing is actually, surprise, surprise, a good thing. You have to try and do one's best to pin down exactly how one is using the term. But also, I know this from previous experience looking at the understanding of science and religion, the whole thing can turn into an extremely extended exercise in etymology and definition and usage, and you get nowhere pretty quickly doing that. So sometimes you just have to kind of take the terminological inexactitude on the chin and move on.
Yeah, well, I guess we can go practical then instead of debating definitions, and we can say, why do you have an interest in Christian nationalism? Why does Theos Think Tank, who you work for, have an interest in Christian nationalism? What is the thing that people are identifying as worth talking about right now?
Personally, I have an interest because my background, my doctorate is in political theology, although nothing to do with nationalism, but that's an area of personal interest for me. Why we are engaging in this? Well, let me put it this way. Theos is 20 years old, nearly. We were launched in 2006 by some quirk of divine humour. That was a month after The God Delusion was published. So you can imagine for the first 5 years or so, all the noise comes from one direction, and it's loud and it's aggressive and it's dismissive. That wave breaks sometime in the 2010s.
Lots of new atheist confrontation.
Yeah. I mean, all you've got to do is say faith is a virus, religion poisons everything, it's a meme, yada, 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 Bronze Age beliefs, and your work is done. And it's very loud, 5 years or so. That's well and truly over now. The interesting thing about at the moment is that, as it were, the cultural noise, having initially for us come from one direction, sort of very secular, atheistic, quite aggressive, actually comes from the other direction almost now, whereby you have a lot of people who thinks that not only is religion central to politics, but it's absolutely vital. It's what sustains it. It's what we need. Now, we're a Christian organisation. We're happy with a lot of those messages, but the way they're articulated and the ends to which they're articulated, that demands some examination, which is why we're trying to.
Yeah, okay. So what are some of the ways that this is articulated, or what are some of the ways that this is used in politics that we might consider to be worrying?
Let me give a little example with the use of the popular term Judeo-Christian. That has been around for a while, and it's got quite an interesting background. It's about 200 or so years old in the English-speaking world, and for most of that, certainly the first century or so, it's a relatively narrowly used theological term to discuss, as far as the 19th century was concerned, the newly discovered, truly Jewish origins of Christianity. Shock horror. In the 20th century, it's picked up in a slightly broader register, and particularly in the interwar period in the 1930s and 40s, as a way of some Christians of bringing Jews into their fold at a time when obviously anti-Semitism was genocidal. So at that time, Judeo-Christian was actually used as a inclusive term, and it was perpetuated.
So Jews and Christians are on the same side here. We should stop fighting each other. We have all of these common values, and we can support each other and defend one another. Yeah,
exactly. And that's from the theological recognition in the 19th century that, goodness me, Christianity in its origins was really very Jewish, and therefore, P.S., the intervening 1800 years of mild to vicious anti-Semitism really makes no logical sense, let alone moral sense. So it's an inclusive term. It still is for some people, but for some people, they will use Judeo-Christian in an exclusive way to mean not Muslim. So they won't talk about Abrahamic inclusion. They'll talk about Judeo-Christianity as a way of defining the West and this is another point we might want to come into, over and against the Islamic world or Muslims within Europe and America. So it can be used in, the term Judeo-Christian in that regard can be used in different ways.
So it turns out to be a term of hostility against Muslims, and I suppose possibly against atheists as well.
So first thing is to say it can be used as a term of hostility, but I emphatically wouldn't say that anybody who ever used the term Judeo-Christian is being Islamophobic. That's simply not the case. The second point, I don't think it's an exclusionary term against atheists because the register is just so religious, right? I think there are other terms or angles around multiculturalism, around deep kind of values that might be more exclusionary of atheists. I mean,
yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting. That's I think a really helpful way of unpacking how that term actually the shift in meaning in kind of popular discourse, because I do find that I typically hear it as a way of saying, us and not them. Our culture should be Judeo-Christian. Our ethics are Judeo-Christian. Our values, as a way of saying it shouldn't be this other thing that these other people are doing.
Yeah, that's right. I think it can be and has in contemporary political discourse been used as a term to exclude primarily Muslims because those are the people who are perceived to be sort of infiltrating Europe and North America.
Yeah. But it is worth making a very important point here. And again, we're talking about the point about how language works. All words simultaneously include and exclude, right? So you could just as easily say, well, if Judeo-Christian is a bit suspect for this reason, why not just use the word Christian? Well, in that sense, you could legitimately be accused of excluding Jews and Muslims. So
yes,
whereas any term can be weaponized in that way, it doesn't necessarily mean that any term that is used is being weaponized.
And I think it's a fascinating term and example, because one of the things we've talked a lot about is the, forms of Christian nationalism. One of the things that they seem to be doing is giving a very narrow definition of Christian to the kind of exclusion of these other things. But then using Judeo-Christian is kind of a way of saying our version of that is actually the real version, and it goes all the way back to ancient kind of Jewish religion, right? So there's also this kind of claim for a sort of ancient authenticity there.
So I think that's exactly right. And that's why it's quite useful when you talk about Christian nationalism, because Christian nationalism, by definition, really, it's a nexus term, right? It's overlaying Christianity with nationalism. And it's really important to recognize that, as it were, you need both of those for it to make sense. Just being a Christian and having an adherence to the nation state, for example, does not make you a Christian nationalist. So Kate Forbes, the Scottish politician who failed to become leader of the Scottish National Party, is a great example of that. Very committed Christian, wanted to be leader of a nationalist party. But no one in their right mind would call Kate Forbes a Christian nationalist in this sense. I think the term comes into its own when they're overlaid with one another. And you say, in order to belong to this nation, you need to be a Christian. Now, most people thinking through that would say, that's balmy. Okay, even people who would be Christian nationalists would say, to be a baptized, believing, church-attending Christian and to belong to this nation. I mean, that wasn't feasible in the Middle Ages, for goodness sake. It isn't feasible today. So what you do is expand the term Christian there to mean Christian values, Christian nation, Judeo-Christian, and then you overlay it with the concept of nationhood. So
it's the focus on values rather than on beliefs that makes it more plausible. It's like we want our nation to be run according to Christian values, whether or not you have Christian belief and go to church on a Sunday. Is that the sort of point?
So this is, I think exactly it is, but this is what we need to probe and what we are going to probe through quantitative research. So there are some bits and bobs of data around suggesting that people who adhere to a Christian nationalist position are more likely not to be attenders, but to be affiliates, if you like. So I identify as a Christian. I hold Christian values. I think we have a Christian culture, or should have a Christian culture, but I don't actually go to church. I don't actually read the Bible. And if that were the case, and that's kind of a hypothesis, that's exactly what you said, Barney, there. Actually, what we're talking about, Christian nationalism is a doctrine around not basing the nation on a baptized believing Christianity, but basing the nation on a generic cultural values-based conception of what being a Christian is.
Well, here's where I can sort of have a bit of sympathy for the Christian nationalist viewpoint, because I can say, well, surely every Christian would want their nation to be run according to Christian values, wouldn't they?
So yes, and this is a critically important point, and not just a Christian, right? If you're a Muslim, you would want the people amongst whom you live and the country amongst whom you live to read and study the Quran and obey Islamic law. If you are a secular humanist, it's perfectly legitimate for you to say, I would like this country to adhere to secular humanist values. Having those quote unquote totalizing value systems, i.e. the kind of beliefs that you think are true and worthy to be shared and held, isn't in and of itself the wrong thing. Critical to the question is how you go about it and what are the ends to which you are aspiring. And I think that is where so much of Christian nationalism does fall down.
All right, so the problem is not wanting your nation to be run by the values of whatever belief system you adhere to, whether Christian or Muslim or atheist or whatever. The problem is the method and the means.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly is the method and the means, and we might come to talk about that, but it's worth thinking about the question of what wanting your country to be run according to Christian values actually means. And I think that's perfectly legitimate, but your country isn't the church. And the ethic that might be legitimately applied to the church cannot legitimately be applied to the country. So to take a very obvious example of that, forgiveness is central to the Christian ethic and should be central to what the church is. Now, you can't impose forgiveness on a country or a polity or a legal system. You can introduce concepts of mercy, definitely, but you can't expect the entire country to have a kind of quasi-salvific role as the church does. Take adultery, for example. Again, a sin as far as Christianity is concerned, but any Christian nation, I mean, Britain, England did twice in the 10th century and in the 17th century, that seeks to punish, to outlaw and to punish adultery, soon gets into a very messy situation. So it's not wrong to want your country to reflect your values, but devil's in the detail. What exactly are your values? And to what extent are those values kind of specific to your ecclesial community, to your church, or appropriate to the nation in which you live?
So one of the questions is like, what does it mean for a nation to have values? And that means that's something different than what it means for a church to have or live out values. Yeah, and I think that's really helpful to say, like, a lot of this conversation, people are kind of confusing those, so they don't have the imagination to say, like, what is a nation state? What are values in that kind of context? And then also, are these values legitimately Christian? Who decides is another big one of those. I mean, I think this is illustrated well, in Europe, a lot of the conversation is like Christian values over against Muslim values. And so there's this opposition to Muslim immigrants. But in the US, right, there's this huge opposition right now to Latin American immigrants, most of whom are Catholic. Right. And it's still a kind of Christian nationalism against them. And so, right, this is about a certain type of evangelical Protestant Christian nationalism over against other forms of Christian culture. Right.
Yeah.
Which I think is so fascinating.
So one way of putting that might be, I think that's right, exactly right. And one way of putting it might be, what are the legitimate centripetal forces for our society, the forces that bring us together? And how distinctively religious should they be? If you scroll back 500 years, one of the reasons why the Anabaptists are so abhorred in the Reformation in the 16th century is because baptism was a way of saying, we belong to this community of Christendom. And so willingly withdrawing
they were
your
considered
membership,
politically dangerous.
Absolutely. And you can completely understand that. Now, over the next 500 years or so, the pendulum swings enormously from that kind of very tight centripetal force is Christian and it's baptized, church-attending believer, through to a slightly more vague, values-based, what holds us together is our kind of generic Christianity, through to other secular forces, as an aside, they'd always been around, right the way to kind of hyper-liberal societies at the end of the 20th century would say, well, effectively, just, the rule of law and effective governments. We don't need any cultural centripetal forces because actually people should be allowed to do what they want to do. That's historically speaking, that's an experiment for human societies.
Well, and it started in America, right? America was sort of the first country that said we're going to completely separate church and state and we're just going to emphasize individual freedom.
Yes, but, and you guys know more about this than me, but this is the Tocqueville, right? That yes, I mean, constitutionally and legally, we don't need a religiously tinged centripetal force to tell us who we are. But that's kind of predicated on the idea that culturally, we know who we are. We have a degree of homogeneity and cohesion. So we don't need the state to force us together. But if you don't get the state bringing you together and you don't have centripetal cultural forces, it invites this question, well, who are we as a collective unit? What does bring us together?
What is it that gives us our distinctive identity anymore? Yeah.
Yeah. In what meaningful sense can I use the word us of this political community?
Yeah. And it's that kind of cultural vacuum in many ways that has given rise to these kind of, post-liberal, anti-liberal various groups, right, that are sort of saying liberalism itself isn't giving us the cultural cohesion to have an us.
So it absolutely is that, but it's that in the context of geopolitics, where for the first time in 200 years, China is a serious global player, and the Islamic world is huge and growing and very cohesive, and for some people, an enormous threat. So it's not just, oh, goodness, this liberalism is tearing us apart. It's, goodness, this liberalism is tearing us apart at a moment where several other civilizational blocks are emerging as powerful and cohesive.
Yeah, so that brings in the dimension of power and fear that I think lies behind a lot of these discussions. Fear that we're going to have less power than other people, and then other people are going to trample on us, and then a desire to seize power in order to preserve ourselves and protect ourselves and defend ourselves from other political powers and other ideological movements, right?
Yeah, it is. And Christian nationalism, Christian nationalists are often accused of fear-mongering. And I think a lot of the time not unreasonably accused of that. And arguably they do so because they're afraid themselves. Now, let's not be naive about this. You don't go to the other extreme and say, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of here. I mean, China has no pretensions at all. And Islam is, universally a peace-loving religion, and no one needs to be afraid of it. You have to be realistic about this. A bit of realpolitik is not a bad thing. But at the same time, fear is a bad political motivator. And in particular, it's a bad motivator to get anything positive done. It's a very good way of denouncing the things that we shouldn't be. But in terms of
violence and tearing things down, I guess.
Absolutely. And we get this particularly in the UK at the moment. I mean, the town just up the road from where I grew up has erupted in violence because of asylum seekers being settled in hotels. And, we had a summer of violence, or a few days at least of violence last summer about this. Now, this is a neuralgic issue. We don't need necessarily to get into immigration. But that kind of strikes me as the problem. It's not just the fact that there's fear there, although I understand that. It's fear coming at the expense of any sense that there might be a moral responsibility to care for those who genuinely are asylum seekers. That can be a nice...
This brings us to a question I had for you when you articulated the roles of the church versus the role of the state. You talked a little bit about how the state shouldn't be expected to do what the church does, and you gave forgiveness as an example. But a lot of my right-wing American friends would completely agree with you that the state shouldn't be doing the same things as the church. The example they would give would be welcome of refugees and immigrants and compassion for the poor and all those kinds of things. To say that's what the church should be doing. The state shouldn't be involved in that. No state funding or resources should go towards any of those things. Would you agree with that?
No. But it's not a mad position at all. It's not a nonsensical position. So this is kind of getting close to the subject of my doctorate, which was on what should the state do vis-a-vis the provision of welfare. As an aside, UK state appropriates about 9% of GDP at the beginning of the 20th century, the majority of which it spends on war. Yeah. 40, 50 years later, it appropriates close to 50% of GDP, the majority it puts on welfare. Then that's an enormous change in the role of the state, a huge change in the space of a lifetime, without a great deal of opportunity for theological reflection. What I come to the conclusion in that particular piece of work is that it's not that the state shouldn't have a role in the provision of welfare. It absolutely should, but it shouldn't usurp the role of civil society in the provision of welfare so much as to enable it. And I think that is where the position on immigration is wrong. It kind of makes no sense to say the state should have no role whatsoever in with regards to asylum and immigration and leave it all to the churches and civil society. Quite apart from the fact that most churches and civil society say we can't cope, I would argue that the state's role is to enable and facilitate the kind of welcome that churches and civil society can provide.
And that you're right that it doesn't make any sense, because a church simply can't grant refugee status to somebody entering their country. Only the state can do that.
Absolutely. It's a political question. That's right.
Part of what you're saying, just I think for me points to when we do rely on the state alone to do that kind of stuff, it's a purely bureaucratic thing, right? And we need sort of civil society. Churches are what provide the kinds of real community responses to these issues that I think people actually need. And the challenge really has been, how do they work together? What does it look like to enable one another? And most of the discourse is kind of, for or against the state doing things.
Yeah. So Catholic social teaching is great on this. And Benedict XVI's encyclical Deus Caritas Est talks about the human being is made for gift. And then he splits out there are three kinds of gift. There's the gift, he's stretching the use of the actual word gift here, but we'll allow him that. There's gift in order to get back. He said that is the logic of exchange. It's the basis of the market. There's gift as a means of duty. Effectively, give because you have to, because it's the right thing to do. It's the responsible thing to do. That is the logic of the state. But there's also gift as gratuity, gift as pure gift of love. No need to do so, no reciprocity in doing so. Gift because it is in human nature to want to give. That's the logic of civil society. And as many, many people have said, the political thought in the West for the last 150 years or so has kind of oscillated between the poles of the state and the market. And Benedict's argument there and elsewhere is that both of those have a role. So going back to your point, Barney, about some people's attitude in the US about the state backing out. No. The state has a role and the market has a role. But when it gets to squeezing out civil society because it is merely voluntary or merely charitable, that harms all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in all of the, in the States, we're sort of caught between either the all-powerful government or the all-powerful billionaires. And in the middle of that would be civil society actually doing the things to help citizens and our communities.
So going back to this question of it's fine to want your country to be run by Christian values or whatever values you have, what are the right and legitimate and good ways to try and seek Christian values in national politics, for example?
I'll give one example, which is so obvious that it's banal because we established it quite a long time ago, but it goes back to an ancient tradition within Christian thought, whereby I think it was Pope Gelasius in the 5th century said, the world is governed by two means, the emperor and the pope effectively, but one of them has access to the sword and one of them does so by the word. And this then precipitated a kind of very slow recognition that ultimately states are going to be coercive, right? They have to be coercive. Every state in the world, even Denmark, ultimately is coercive. But the higher, better form of Christian political engagement is discursive. It is through word and persuasion rather than coercion. Now, we take that for granted because the decisions that we make in our polities are decided in Senate or in Parliament or wherever it is. But persuasion and information, maybe with a bit of rhetoric thrown in, I think is a cardinal kind of Christian value when it comes to the appropriate way to try to change your society. And I do think this is relevant at the moment in this context, this conversation about Christian nationalism, because there's an awful lot of virility in Christian nationalist rhetoric. Actually, there's quite a virility in a lot of kind of rhetoric at the moment, and lots to do with kind of the crisis of masculinity and so on and so forth. But kind of strength and force are clearly not seen as a bad thing. As I said, I don't want to be naive. States are ultimately coercive. But I think it's really important, going back to your point about how we do this, Barney, is that if you want your country to be Christian, you do so through persuasion rather than through quote unquote muscular interventions.
Yeah, that's very profound. And that taps us into a little bit of the deep roots of political theology and church history, where it's developed this distinction between the coercion of the state and the sort of the persuasion. Thing is, though, it seems to me that what ends up happening is, in a democracy, it's the persuasion of the Christian nationalist argument that then wins elections and then leads to the coercion of the state. So they're sort of reciprocally related in the end.
I mean, they could be. You might have just had a kind of a flash forward for 10 years or so there. To the best of my knowledge, that hasn't happened yet. I guess you could make the point, I mean, you might want to come back on this, how Trump's perfectly fair election victory at the end of last year has led to a situation whereby he is now systematically trying to dismantle independent institutions of power, where they are kind of universities or press or the courts, in those that might get in the way of his legislative agenda. Is that the kind of thing you're referring to?
Yeah. I just mean, like, Donald Trump won an election, and I think you don't hear voices on the left this time round accusing the election of being somehow rigged or influenced by Russia or anything like that. It seems to have been a relatively legitimate election. So that must have been brought about by persuasion. And yet what was elected was a platform that enabled Trump to take some very coercive measures.
So I think that's right. And this is, I mean, there's a small cottage industry of this at the moment, of the kind of how democracies die type books, which make the point I think you're making here, and I think it's a perfectly valid point, that democracies rarely die by strongman enters stage left, decapitates the populace, and places himself in godlike autocratic position for all eternity. It's not that blunt. And, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And unfortunately, we're looking for the repetition of history. Although, of course, Hitler wins an election, so even that doesn't quite work out. What does happen is democracies are not simply every 4-5 years, however much it might be, people voting for who's in charge. They are a kind of a pretty rich ecology of independent institutions and organizations and processes and constitutional protections and so on and so forth that enable the functioning of a free country. Get into power, and then you slowly kind of undo those independent institutions, and you find that you have zombie democracies, one that, they do turn up and vote every 4 or 5 years or so, but you pretty pretty guaranteed to know what the result is going to be because there isn't an independent press to report on the facts and because state pours all its money into a particular party. So that is a real danger, yes.
And it is, I think it's an interesting moment right now thinking about Christian nationalism, again, being a very particular form of Christianity. I mean, this is the thing, in many ways, in America, Christianity has been all about persuasion, right? Whatever the most popular form of Christianity is. This is kind of how evangelicalism has functioned, as a populist theology. And I wonder if you could just say a bit about the role and nature of the church, how that kind of functions, because, it's often been not the church, but just individuals with Bibles, selling a vision of Christianity and nationalism that has really caught on and shaped, certainly in the US, not so much in the UK, maybe a little bits here and there.
So let me get this right. I mean, is the question around the role that the church has and should play in responding to Christian nationalism, do you mean? Or what? Can you just clarify that a bit for me?
Yeah, well, just, in terms of how do you see like the institution of the church? What does it look like? What's its role? Would you say it needs to sort of oppose these other forms of Christianity to help the nation see what a genuine set of Christian values would be? What's it kind of doing? I just think it's an interesting moment where in many ways it's a populist form of persuasion is what's gotten us to this form of Christian nationalism to begin with.
Yeah. So I'm tempted to say, although it might sound facetious, it certainly isn't intended to be, that the church's job in this is to worship properly, which is a bit of a trite thing to say. But what I actually mean by that is, as has often been remarked, you become like that which you worship. So if the church is worshipping properly, in that rather vague formulation, it will be building disciples. It will be building people who are holy in a true and meaningful sense of that word, and are as examples that one would hope attract others. And that is its foremost task. I kind of think that is worth underlining, because there is the danger for the church to kind of go political here, go nakedly political and say, goodness me, this is a moment we really need to step in here, and we need to bang the drum and bang the gavel for protection of asylum seekers and immigrations and for environmental policy and so on and so forth. Now, it should do all that. But if it doesn't do that from a basis of right worship, it becomes something that it's not. It becomes a political party with a kind of moral halo to it, rather than the Bride of Christ, disciple-making organization, the implications of its work having political repercussions. So I kind of think that's the first thing. And then other things could and should naturally flow out of that.
Yeah, I mean, exactly kind of what this is what I was thinking of is, it often seems to me that the church has spent so much time speaking about values and ignoring character, right? Not really building communities and people that act in certain ways, but just a really loud megaphone to yell at everyone for not having the right values. And I often just think, what even are values? All these people are horrible people, right?
Yeah. And there's a very good point about how Victorians didn't talk about values. They talked about virtues. Values are an interestingly modern, somewhat kind of subjective idea, because you can attach the word values to anything. The Nazis had values, but you wouldn't talk about Nazi virtues. Virtues is more of the language of character and objective good. Values is the language of generic appreciation and subjective good. So virtues rather than values, I would make a case for.
Well, yeah, I mean, I do very much agree with the importance of character and the sort of how good character filters upwards into politics over a long period of time, because it's people of poor character who end up being duped by demagogues and rhetoric and that kind of thing. But at the same time, you can't reasonably talk about running a country according to virtues. You can talk about running a country according to certain values. So I can see why the term value has more salience in political discourse.
Yeah. You don't want to be naive about it. And also, let's not overly romanticize the character building of the enthusiastic evangelicals at the beginning of the 19th century in Britain. Yes, I mean, there's a huge amount to admire there, but there was also a reasonable amount of prurience and sort of moral oppression and judgment and lack of forgiveness. So, yeah.
But again, that's a genuine lack of virtue. They just didn't understand that they lacked virtue in those ways. Because it is, I think there's a lot to be said. I don't disagree, Barney, but I do think, like, especially these days, as a Christian, I find myself saying, I don't care so much what people's values are. If they have genuine virtue, I would prefer to have them in political power. I would prefer to have, if they are genuinely prudent and genuinely just people, then we want them in politics, even if they have different kind of religious or moral values than I do. That's going to be way better than all of these corrupt, horrible people claiming to have, Christian values or arguing about what the values are. I just wonder, I sometimes think you probably could do a whole lot of governing just based on people having virtue than arguing over these values that no one actually is carrying out or caring about anyways, right?
Well, those two things are intimately connected in the end, because you say somebody having the virtue of upholding justice, but then that smuggles in a whole load of values about what justice is, and holding justice as a value, it can also be talked about. So I guess you can't completely separate those two concepts anyway.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, are there any final concluding remarks you'd like to make, Nick?
Well, maybe one with regard to almost where we started from, which is that the need to try and be as precise in our terms as possible. We established right at the beginning that ultimate precision is chimerical in all this, because words are used in different ways and always will be. But it does seem to me that there is I've read quite a few essays to this effect, that there's an inclination to treat what are, I would argue, perfectly legitimate conservative Christian positions in public life as if they are part of a nationalist or far-right or extremist agenda, which by implication, I think correctly, are not legitimate. This is the Overton window question, right? What is the space for legitimate public discourse here? And I think there is just a danger of nudging the Overton window ever so further, just kind of the liberal left, so that you treat somebody who, say, might be anti-abortion as the moral equivalent for somebody who is anti-Muslims, as the moral equivalent of somebody who is anti-vaccine or whatever else.
So just lumping all of those different issues together, as if you're against abortion, then you must be a terrible Christian nationalist who hates Muslims. Yeah,
it's partly that. It's partly guilt by association, but it's actually more that you delegitimize views that you disagree with by implying that they cannot legitimately be held in public discourse. So an example of that would be, I would say that racism, outright racist views, white supremacist views are not part of legitimate public discourse. And people who voice them, as it were, should be shut down or shouldn't be offered a platform or whatever. But voices around anti-abortion are perfectly legitimate. But if you kind of associate the two and say, basically, these right-wing, Christian right-wing extremists, they believe things like anti-abortion and a lot of them are white supremacists. If you lump them all together in that way, you're delegitimizing some views that I think should be legitimate in public. You're moving the Overton window. As I said, you're moving the Overton window towards a kind of liberal left direction. And that happened with regards to immigration in the UK 20 or so years ago. I wrote a book on the subject. Immigration was treated, anti-immigration sentiments were treated as basically racist by some people. And therefore, they were delegitimized. But in the long run, that was an unfair move, and it was a counterproductive move.
Very interesting. It's possible to be anti-immigration without being racist, and one can voice anti-immigrant sentiments without being rightly accused of racism.
Yeah. Yeah. And you know, for example, you have to be able to hold open the Overton window to accommodate discussions about immigration, particularly in our globalized, high travel world as it is. Because if you shut down, if you delegitimize conversations about immigration by saying they're basically racist, and immigration still happens, sentiment doesn't go away. It will emerge in particularly grotesque, aggressive, and violent, and genuinely racist forms. That's the point of why liberal societies, in the truest sense of the word, are successful, because you give the air, if not necessarily the oxygen, to variety of complex, sometimes distasteful views in order to process the variety of views. Yes, you do have to draw the limits, but at the same time, I would argue that you have to try and keep that Overton window as open as you possibly can.
I'm all for talking more about immigration, especially as I've just written a book that will be coming out in 3 months on the topic.
Oh, interesting. So, what's
that? It's called On the Significance of Religion in Immigration Policy. It's a co-authored book. And
I will look out for that.
Yeah.
What you're saying, it's one of the things that I think is challenging about it is that in a very polarized political context, it's one thing to say in our general discourse, we need space for people to have a range of these opinions to come together to talk about them. The difficulty, I think the thing I see people doing is they're saying, if you're, even slightly to the right on immigration, you're going to vote for someone who's going to be racist and horrible to immigrants. And if you're slightly to the left, right, you're going to vote. And so your opinions don't matter at all. They're going to translate into that politician's opinions, and that politician's opinions are abhorrent. I wonder if you just could say a little bit about what do we do with that? We still need to hold that space open, but it does genuinely translate into a kind of extreme results on different sides.
Does it though? I'm not so sure that it does. And in fact, I think the alternative as well. So I think if you wanted, if you set out to generate general, widespread, aggressively anti-racist, xenophobic, and aggressively anti-immigration, xenophobic, and possibly even racist views, the best thing you could do would be to come down like a ton of hot bricks on anybody who says anything negative about immigration. Anybody who says, I think immigration levels are too high at the moment, racist. If you continue doing that, if you continue to undermine and delegitimize their views simply because you find them distasteful, because you don't agree with them, what will happen in the long run is they will run into the arms of people who are genuine demagogues on this matter. I think...
that could be exactly what has happened, right?
I think it has. Yeah. I think it absolutely has. I mean, you'll know your political context better than mine, but I happened to have been in Tennessee last week and chatting to a few people, and one of whom said to me that the Democrats didn't get it on immigration, right? They didn't get it. They just there was this kind of view that they held that anybody who held was anti-immigrant or anti-immigration views was basically outside the Overton window, was unacceptable. Now, I've no idea whether that's true or not. That might be perception. But even if it was just perception, it's a telling perception.
Yeah, that's right. Shutting down possible dialogue, it always backfires on you.
I think it does in the long run. I mean, don't get me wrong, it's a slightly nerve-wracking thing to invite into open, free public discourse people whose views you think are fundamentally wrong.
Or dangerous even.
Or dangerous. But come on, let's read a bit of John Locke here, right? At the end of the 17th century, advocating on toleration, brackets, on biblical basis, in which he makes the point that, effectively, yes, those views that are a security concern, as we might put it today, can be bracketed out. That's why he had a problem with Catholics. It was primarily a political issue. But it's the church, going back to an earlier thing of our conversation, the church's job is looking at sin. The state's job is to look at crime. And don't treat views that you consider to be sinful, or in our parlance, distasteful, as if they are criminal, or in our parlance,
that's just what James Walters said, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. But of course, today, the difference today is that we're maybe lacking in spaces for genuine discourse among fellow citizens, and instead we have massive social media platforms to kind of platform views that are otherwise distasteful or dangerous. And often we're sort of, it's one thing to say you're not allowed to speak when we gather together as a community to talk about this, but it's another thing to say, I'm not going to give you a microphone to talk to millions of people around the world. Do you think that makes any difference?
Oh man, does it? Does it? I mean, this is a whole other conversation, isn't it? But when Twitter, etc., were starting out, the kind of mood music was, this was a conversation. This was a genuine national conversation. This is the kind of thing that politicians call for, always a national conversation on this. Well, I think in that regard, social media is, as the conversation, what snipers are to pitched combat. So, in pitched combat, you're there, you're in the public, right? You can be harmed. You are a vulnerable agent in this debate.
Yeah.
The sniper doesn't reveal anything of themselves. They can stand on a rooftop and crouch and just take off the views that they hate without any kind of real vulnerability to themselves. And I think that is the critical difference. I think the anonymity and the fact that, all the obvious points reduced to 142 or 284 characters, et cetera, that all matters. And compressing communication like that is a catastrophe. But communication is about commonness, right? It's about communion. In what sense am I holding myself in common with you when I take a pot shot at you through Twitter?
Right.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So it is that need for renewal of if spaces in which genuine discourse is happening, and in those spaces, people being able to articulate these variety of views and not being sort of shut down, and so that they run into more extreme versions of those views.
Yeah, and hold them in ways that you are going to be accountable for. I can say what the hell I like on Twitter. Other social media platforms are available, I should emphasize. But I can say what the hell I like without really being held to account by people.
Yeah, that's right. Whereas you do have the added possibility of kind of social ostracization and repercussions for what you say in real life, which is a vital aspect, I think.
Well, this has been very, very rich and informative, and I think you've advanced our conversation quite a bit, especially in the realm of definitions and of sort of making sure you don't move the Overton window. So it's been really, really helpful. Thank you so much, Nick.
Your pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you both.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Faith at the Frontiers, a podcast that confronts challenges to the Christian faith with hope. If you liked this episode, then do subscribe to hear more like it in the future. For now, goodbye.